Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. We are going to discuss the doings of the day in U.S. democracy while it lasts. A lot has happened in this country over the past week. I mean, we are going to get to the raid and its aftermath. I mean, it is absolutely crazy. But let's start with the primaries. We had two primaries yesterday, one in Alaska where they have ranked choice voting, and then the primary, everybody's been kind of waiting for. Lynn Cheney faced a challenge from a Trump-supported election denier in Wyoming, and lost badly as expected, to the challenger Hageman, who was backed by Trump. I mean, about almost 2 to 1. Actually, about 2 to 1. And Lynn Cheney has basically came out swinging afterwards. She is actually putting together an organization to basically educate the country about Trump. Real quickly, we'll talk about the Alaska too, because Alaska, Murkowski also supported the impeachment at the Senate level. And they have an instant runoff system up in Alaska, and much like similar to what is going to be instituted in Eureka. Actually, it's ranked choice, and she did survive the Senate, and will be running against Kelly Shabaka, I hope I'm saying that right, who is the Trump-backed candidate in November. Murkowski did come out first. We'll see if she survives. All other news, Sarah Palin advanced to run against the Democrat there. The Democrat did receive the plurality, the most votes, but when you combine all of the Republican votes, it does seem that Sarah Palin is going in with an advantage, and considering that Alaska is a very red state, it would seem that she has the advantage to have the House seat there. Other news is that the Secretary of State, Republican candidate back in Wyoming, is also an election denier. So Trump expanding his reign. Of the 10 House impeachment votes, only two, the two in Washington state, will be advancing to the primaries and probably survive to Congress. The other 8 have either been defeated or resigned. And to be fair, it wasn't all due to Trump challenges. Kinzinger got redistricted out. The Democrats gerrymandered in Illinois, and he didn't have a chance of winning the general. Who knows how he would have fared in the primary there. Lynn Cheney, as you've predicted in the past, is considering a run for president. Nobody knows whether that means running in the Republican primary at some point, or running as an independent, but she has said she'll think about it, but she is definitely not going away. She definitely wants to fight what she called the scourge of Trump and Trumpism in her party. She's not backing down. She's earned the respect across the party, even with people who oppose her on 99% of the issues, as some Democrats say. Dave, you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, sure. So a lot happened, even though it was just a couple of states, Wyoming and Alaska, last night. I prefer to start with Wyoming only because of the kind of Venn diagram of the national political scene. I think Liz Cheney is at the middle of the January 6th committee hearings, the sort of tribal infighting that's going on within the Republican Party, we'll call it, and the rise of Trumpism and its influence on all of the primaries and all of the states, and in fact general election of the 2022 midterms, and then on, even people are there's already countdown timers to the presidential election of 2024. So why do I say that? Well, because in part in the Wyoming race, they have one congressional seat, and the challenger, Liz Cheney's challenger, who won by nearly 40 points. It was It was as big as landslides kind of can be in primary. You don't really see much that magnitude for a sitting incumbent. Incumbents have a 96% reelection rate nationwide for the last 50, 70 years. So this is a major
and
change.
last time around, she got over 70% of the vote.
Yeah. And so her challenger, Hagerman, she actually, in the 2016 election, she said that Donald Trump was a racist and a xenophobe and the weakest candidate of all the candidates in the presidential primary run. So it just shows you how much has shifted since then. And so when you see the kind of journalists covering the average person's opinion in Wyoming, there are a very small subset of anecdotal folks who are saying, look, Cheney on principle, we're going to stick with her, or Cheney on principle, we're going to, even though we're Democrats, we're going to convert to Republican just to show some support. But as you could see in a state that is so heavily Republican, that just was nowhere near enough. And so that leads, like you said, that leads Cheney to what's next in her speeches, her after election comments. I think it was I wanted to mention this, that she talked about Lincoln and talked about how Lincoln had lost a senatorial race and a congressional race before becoming president, and how there was a higher calling. So she's kind of trying to tap into that tradition.
Cited Grant too.
Yeah, actually, I think this was. It's funny that you say that. You anticipate my thought here. In my family, there's a saying when you talk about really, bucking up, sticking with your convictions, and fighting an uphill battle against all odds, and doing what you need to do. And we say we're gonna tackle this like Grant took Richmond, and so it's one of those things that it comes from military view of self-motivation, but in fact Liz Cheney did say Grant was at the crossroads when they were losing badly at the Battle of the Wilderness in the Civil War. The North was losing, and they reached that crossroads. Grant rode to the front and led his troops south towards Richmond, and basically doubled down and said, this is a higher calling. We can't, no more defeats. We're gonna dig in and do what we need to do. So this is like I said, this is a serious conflict within the Republican Party, and we could talk more about Alaska, but I'm going to hand over to you.
Let's come back to that, because I don't want to lose track of Alaska, and then we can come back to that, because we'll be probably talking about the Republican Party in all three of our segments. So let's talk about Alaska before we lose track. Is Murkowski in trouble? Is she doing? What are her chances now? People have been writing her political epitaph for years. I mean, she always gets challenged. She is a genuine moderate. She kind of waffles back and forth sometimes, but she does seem to have a way of surviving. This has happened to her before, where she ran as an independent after losing the primary. She does sometimes get people, Democrats supporting her, in Alaska. What does this say about her chances in November?
So, I'm gonna talk about Murkowski in a second, but first I want to go to the congressional race, because I think that's telling. That tells about sort of the breakout of where people lie, in my mind, because so it's a little confusing, but there's two elections simultaneously in Alaska going on right now. One for deceased Congressman Young's seat through the end of the term, through the end of the year, and then the next one is for the full term, 2 years that follow. And so they had like 19 candidates running in the jungle primary, they call it, where the top 4 get to move on. Well, in the special election for just the interim period, it was actually narrowed down to 4 candidates, one of which two were Democrats, 2 were Republicans. One of the Democrats dropped out to try to give some support to the other Democrat. That Democrat got 35% of the vote. The 2 Republicans got, Palin got about 35 and the other one got about 32. So what that means is that when it comes to if the Republicans do end up focusing their efforts, they have about 67% of the people. Two out of 3 voters in Alaska are Republican. So the question is, which Republican wins, basically. And I think Sarah Palin has a pretty good shot.
Good shot. I will say one thing, though. There are a lot of people, Republicans included, who were really angry when she left her governor spot early to do a television reality show and make money. I mean, it showed a lot of people thought, well, she's not really serious. She didn't win to be vice president, and here she was in the middle of her second year as governor. She just quit like that. That's going to be used against her. It was used against her a little bit in this one. Like, how serious is she about this? And will she just quit again if there's some other thing? There are Republicans who, will they go for the Democrat? I don't know. I mean, that might be an issue for some of them. We'll see.
And one interesting element of this, too, is that if you look back for when she was running for vice president, at least my observation and some of the observations I recall, although it's a while ago, was that she seemed kind of obviously underwhelmingly prepared to be a national leader, or for that matter, to be governor, to be honest. But anyway, she stood out as being like particularly so I'll say it this way. She kind of like she cleared the path for a candidate like Trump, who was more about the theatrics and more about the drama, less about the substance and the preparedness and the experience. We'll say it that way. But now when you look back at her, she seems downright moderate, almost, compared to some of the other Trump-backed candidates around the country. So she's not as obviously ill-informed and underprepared. But so anyway, so let's look at how.
I mean, I remember when we all thought Dan Quayle was extreme. Right. I mean, and now he's like the moderate who convinced Pence not to partake in the coup attempt. So, anyway.
Yeah, no, it's true. But then, so what are we talking about in the senatorial race here in Alaska? I think it's close. I think it's a close call where Trump-backed candidates have a slight advantage just because of the base and its energy and its willingness to flip the table. So the candidate that is the Republican running against Palin, that comes from a very strong Democratic political background in the state. Massive name recognition. Everybody knows that name, and they know that family as Democrats. So that's why I think that Palin has a little bit of a better chance, because it's a little bit easier for Trump supporters to say, well, I know Palin, and she doesn't come from a Democratic family. Yeah. But where Murkowski lies on the other side, there's going to be Trump supporters who are saying, we want to get rid of Murkowski because she's too moderate for us. But there's a lot of folks who are saying, but we know her, and we don't, we may have reservations about electing a Democratic family into the House who's pretending to be a Republican, or not pretending, but who is running as a Republican. But in this case, Murkowski, we know that's a Republican family, and so Murkowski has less of the baggage, I think, and so it's going to be
she's going to get all the Democratic votes. I mean, so
I think she has a really good chance actually of holding on to her seat.
Yeah. All right. So going back to what is Lynn Cheney's future? What do you say? You've actually said that she may be someday the Republican candidate. I don't think it's going to be 2024, but she obviously has a long game in mind. She wants to recover the soul of the Republican Party, and at some point there will come a time when Trumpism is gone, and the Republicans who didn't stand up to Trump are probably going to be in a little bit of trouble, is what she's banking on. And who are those Republicans going to be? I mean, there aren't that many of them, really. Certainly not who are holding office right now that are standing up to him. And as you mentioned, Hageman used to be one, but completely turned around. We know that there are a lot of senators that privately hate his guts, but won't admit it publicly. Right. They some of them went and backed him right away last week. Some of them were smart enough to keep their mouths shut. McConnell definitely, saw a trap in this whole thing with the FBI. Did not, and I think, whereas McCarthy went off half cocked, you haven't even really heard from him since the word espionage came out, and the rest. So they don't know what to do. And all of a sudden now Pence today came out, and we'll talk a bit about that next session. But so what is Lynn Cheney's future here?
So our colleague Aaron is the one who predicted. He's been saying it. He claims to have been saying it for years, but he certainly has been saying it since before January 6th, that he thinks Liz Cheney will be the first woman elected president. So just because of just all the I's and T's that she crosses as a she voted consistently with Trump 97% of the time. She comes from a family with credentials that are a mile deep in the party. So the question is, what's her motive? Maybe 2024 she's the leader of a movement, or a spokesperson of a movement that's not ready to receive her. That's what you alluded to. That 2024 might be too soon. It's because of the heated battle going on in the party right now. But I do think, just for example, she in her 13-minute speech yesterday, she did lay down the gauntlet, and she said if a Secretary of State says that they don't believe in the election, that's undemocratic and unacceptable and crosses the line. If a governor says they don't trust in the election process, that's, again, it crosses the line. It's undemocratic, and we can't stand for that. So she's willing. I think she wants to be part of a set of folks. Adam Kinzinger said the same thing. He wants to target people. They want to target people that they think are bringing the country in the wrong direction under the banner of the Republican Party.
Yeah, but Kinzinger, you can see a case for him because I believe he's pro-choice. He's moderate. She's not moderate, or hasn't been traditionally. Now, she has turned around on gay marriage because she has a sister and all of that, and her sister was really angry with her for the longest time. She's reversed that, but she also didn't double down on torture. And that's not a popular position. The country is gradually moving left, particularly on social issues. I guess she could move left on those things, or move to the center anyways on that. But she would have to do some considerable moving, I think, before she could. It's one thing to be vice president and have all of those positions, but this is not 2000 or 2004. The country you have an increased Latino vote happening now. Granted, that abortion isn't that issue, but the whole country in general is socially moving to the left. At any rate, she is going to have to, if she wants to be president, she's going to have to move to the left on a bunch of issues. But she's already done that with gay marriage, so we'll see.
Or she'll team up with Pence as his vice president, but we'll see. To be continued.
This is not a game. Every one of us must be committed to the eternal defense of this miraculous experiment called America. And at the heart of our democratic process are elections. They are the foundational principle of our Constitution. 2 years ago, I won this primary with 73% of the vote. I could easily have done the same again. The path was clear. But it would have required that I go along with President Trump's lie about the 2020 election. It would have required that I enable his ongoing efforts to unravel our democratic system and attack the foundations of our republic. That was a path I could not and would not take. No House seat, no office in this land is more important than the principles that we are all sworn to protect.
Okay, well, the second session obviously deals with Trump. We had this raid last Tuesday. A lot of Republicans came out, immediately condemned the FBI. We saw in the Republican fringe defund the FBI. I mean, they started to sound like Antifa, right? I mean, it was crazy. But then all of a sudden there was this call to basically make public the warrant, and Garland responded and actually came out with a fiery response about how irresponsible it was to be attacking the FBI. The FBI received death threats. One person went and got himself killed. Somebody who had actually participated in January 6th, went with an assault rifle. And Trump, said, "Oh, please don't do it," but then double down on bad-mouthing the FBI. So Republicans are a little bit of a quandary here. They're backing him, saying this is politically motivated. On the other hand, they apparently, reportedly, the FBI came out with, I think it was over 20 boxes and 11 sets of what are being called classified documents, possibly nuclear related. We're not getting any details of the rest. And the big question is, what was he doing with them? What did he intend to do with them? Hopefully he hasn't done anything with them already. And apparently they took his passport. He's made a big deal about that. Strictly party line. The Democrats, of course, are condemning him and condemning the attacks on the FBI. The Republicans are either staying quiet. Mitch McConnell was smart enough to keep his mouth shut and not say anything, and we really haven't heard a whole lot from him. But a lot of other Republicans just went out on a limb backing him. Apparently, the Republicans, the base is fired up and ready to support him on this, and are ready to turn out to vote for whom. We don't know. Depends on who's running, I guess. In the midterms, will this turn things around for Republicans? How will this affect the national politics? It seems to have consolidated Trump's power over the Republican Party, and if Trump wants to be the candidate, it looks like DeSantis and anybody else is out. Dave?
Yeah, so a couple angles on this prism as a way to look at this, and so the first thing I would like to say, I think, is that the fact that people were jumping out the window with hair on fire, over the top, vitriolic condemnations immediately. I just think that's just a symptom of a toxic political climate that's only marginally related to what actually happened. And I would say that another element of this that's really important is that not a lot of information was even out there in the beginning when this was all happening. And so one of the things that I said last week was what I thought I had heard, or kind of reading the tea leaves, was that Trump really just thinks that he can take what he wants if it's his, and he doesn't really have to follow the rules. And if I say it's unclassified, it's unclassified. That's kind of what was out there in the periphery. Yeah. Well, Bolton, one of his advisors, Bolton, have come out and basically said that same thing, that if you think he is strategic, you're giving him too much credit. He just took the stuff that he wanted to take. And then so there's this other prism, which is, well, if everybody was overly vitriolic for political reasons, why did they do so? And when I say everybody, I mean the Republican Party actors, elected officials and commentators, because it was way over the top. If you check out the article in The Atlantic, where it's just got a list of like 20 different quotes that are just calling, I'm not even going to say all the awful things that they were saying. It was just way, way, way over the top. And so in part because Trump was on the back foot, DeSantis was getting more popular. January 6th committee hearings were just beginning to hammer home with the cause and effect elements to this. Maybe not a lot of Republicans paid attention, but enough of the country was starting to see, wow, there are things that happened on January 6th. This guy, former President Trump, has done some pretty awful things, and he may be the cause of a lot of the drama that's happening. That was starting to get traction. But when this happened, now I think it's just like it really, your question was, how will this impact national politics? I do think that this shifts things back onto Trump's side in terms of his sway and influence over the loudest voices within the Republican Party.
Within the Republican Party, but I think it's contained there because there was a poll taken in Wisconsin. Mandela Barnes, according to a Marquette University poll, back in June, they had him 2 points ahead of Ron Johnson. This poll was taken August 10th to August 15th, now has him 7 points ahead. And I think this is part of it because that means a lot of center people are moving. So if you're talking about people who are not really in the Republican Party, not into this. So this might galvanize the lunatic fringe within the Republican Party, but I think it's contained there. And I think that a lot of the people who have been moved by the January 6th thing, we'll see. We're going to have to see more evidence of this as this comes out. But that poll ought to terrify the Republican leadership. Trump probably doesn't care. All he cares about is his. But if Ron Johnson can't win re-election, they can kiss any chance of taking the Senate goodbye, because they're losing. I mean, Oz is just blowing it right and left against Fetterman. I mean, we'll talk about
that's
the
our next segment. Later.
Yeah. I mean, but that to me is a big indication, because I'm wondering if this raid and the Republican response to it is partly responsible for that poll result. And so, because Marquette University is ranked high, 538, it gives it an A/B status. And so, it consolidates them. And DeSantis is out there criticizing the FBI. I notice he's gone quiet. You go ahead.
So just to comment on Ron Johnson, because I know that you're putting a lot of credence in that, and the polling itself, I support that vision, that perspective, but I would say Ron Johnson got caught up in the conspiracy crime conversation, and he's been, he's knee deep in criminal liability himself.
Right.
So it may be a state specific awareness happening there.
He also just voted against insulin caps and a bunch of other, so he may be in trouble anyway. But I mean, it's just so it's hard to say. I mean, but the question is yes, it's consolidating his power within the Republican Party. But is that good for the Republicans? I mean, it's just it may just, I mean, is it going to jeopardize them being able to take over the House? I noticed that, again, we'll talk about this next segment, and this is really the issue here. But yeah, it does seem to have consolidated his power within the Republican Party, because nobody but Liz Cheney and a handful of others are standing up to him.
Well, I think let's look at the actual raid and the actual criticisms of Trump's behavior, and then the criticisms of the accountability that was imposed by the DOJ and the FBI here. And so, again, I think the information is still trickling out, but we now know enough that because the story changed quite a bit. Trump's sort of responses to first it was an inexcusable raid, and then
FBI planted it.
Yeah, planted evidence. There's this whole evolution of cover up for the fact that he just does what he wants when he wants to do it, and that he actually was in the possession of some of these documents. So one of the things is that there were documents in his possession that you can only, with very high level of security, go into secure buildings and view these documents, and then you have to leave them behind. Now, granted, he's the president. Somebody probably brought it to him. I'm not saying that he took them himself, but the idea is that there are very high level state secrets that put people's lives at risk. That's that top tier of evidence that supposedly he had, documents that supposedly he had. And again, this is supposedly
either nuclear or putting spies at risk, that type of thing.
Right. Yeah. And so one of them was Macron, the leader of France. There was something about him which he probably, there was some degree of leverage he probably liked to hold on to. That's my hunch. But it's unsubstantiated, of course, because we don't know exactly what these documents were. But when you mentioned nuclear, and so there was an intelligence briefing that was released in 2019, I think, that basically said that Trump's conversations with the Saudis are a national security risk when it comes to potential nuclear power, I think it was, because of the dual use technologies, et cetera. So there's this connection that Trump has with the Saudis that in theory could have been part of that. And again, this is speculation. We don't know exactly the content of these documents, but the point is that we should, I think, realize that the archives, for folks who don't pay that close attention, the National Archives did go to his house and say, hey, we're going to need some of this stuff back. They did talk to his lawyers, and the lawyers said, no, we don't have anything, but if we do, don't worry, we'll lock it up. And then so there's been this ongoing conversation January through June where I think the DOJ finally reached a point where, somebody came forward. Apparently there's a mole within Trump's circle who said, no, he actually has it, and he actually has it at Mar-a-Lago. And that was enough, in theory, for them to get the warrant that they needed and for the judge to approve it. And so anyway, this followed a process. It followed a legal process, apparently. And
not only that, they were very careful. This was not a reckless thing like some people thought ahead of time. Right. They were very careful.
And so the question is are these Espionage Act potential violations enough to disqualify him to be president, or to put him in some kind of liability, whether it's some degree of prosecutorial impact, whether it's money or prison or whatever. And the question is, we don't know the answer to that. Right. But I do think that this was very calculated and it wasn't an easy decision to make, and arguably highly controversial. And so I'm going to lead me into Pence. So Pence today gave a speech in New Hampshire, which is where people go when they want to run for president. And he was asked, are you going to testify when the January 6th committee, if they ask you? And he said, well, this is it's a question of the division of powers between the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. It would, if they served me with a request, I would deeply consider it. But then he went on to say, like, they're probably, I doubt this would happen. In part, he was alluding to the fact that his two top lawyers already told them everything that they need to know, and that he's not going to add to it. And so that chances are he's not going to actually be called out for that. But the fact that he could just flat out say, yes, I was pressured to commit a conspiratorial crime by the president, that would be historic. He doesn't need to go there, but he's hinting that he would.
Yeah, no, and the fact that he's made this speech and everything, maybe he will be a challenge in this, to it. I mean, and maybe he's getting some idea that there's actually going to be charges filed. I mean, this is going to be interesting. Will charges be filed? I mean, Garland he doesn't do anything recklessly. I mean, he's frustrating the January 6th committee with how slow he's taking to do this stuff, right? I mean, so this was a year and a half, and some people are saying, man, if he had nuclear codes or nuclear information, why did they wait a year and a half to go in there? They should have gone in there right away, right? Well, it's at any rate, it's they did it, and do they even have everything? And who was the mole? Everybody wants to know. It's just it's got all this intrigue, but there are people who will accept it, and I'm on forums with Trump supporters, and one by one they accept each of his explanations, even though they contradict each other from 1 minute to the next. There's even a meme out there joking. You've got the blue pill of one explanation, the red pill of the other, and you've got the character saying you swallowed them both. It's just it's ridiculous. I think the last one was interns packed it and he didn't know, right? I mean, it was just and you can't have a standing order that everything you take home is declassified. It doesn't work that way, and some documents can't be declassified. And it's just go ahead.
And I know we just have a minute left, and so the documents don't have to be classified in order for this to be a crime. Number one. Yeah. Number two. If he is prosecuted and found guilty for some of these document crimes, I think that might kind of start to tear at the fabric of his invincibility, knowing that there's this larger set of 2 or 3 other conspiracies, at least one substantial criminal conspiracy that the Justice Department is still kind of circling around, and maybe this is just one of those like quicksand. They figure this is the first tangible open and shut case because they pulled the documents from the house. The crime is real.
We keep saying that, but nothing seems to shake his crowd.
Just now, the Justice Department has filed a motion in the Southern District of Florida to unseal a search warrant and property receipt relating to a court-approved search that the FBI conducted earlier this week. That search was of premises located in Florida belonging to the former president. The department did not make any public statements on the day of the search. The former president publicly confirmed the search that evening, as is his right. Faithful adherence to the rule of law is the bedrock principle of the Justice Department and of our democracy. Upholding the rule of law means applying the law evenly, without fear or favor. Under my watch, that is precisely what the Justice Department is doing.
Which takes us to the midterms. Where are we at? And I've noticed a big shift. Today I looked at 538. They now give the Democrats a 63 in 100 chance of, or 63 scenarios out of 100 of retaining the Senate. I mean, it just keeps going up and up. It went from 62 to 63 because I think of the Barnes poll, but I don't know. It might have been because of Fetterman raising money off of Oz's latest horrible gaffe. He was, trying to talk about this horrible inflation. He was at a grocery store. He misnamed the grocery store, and then he made a reference to crudite. I'm probably saying it wrong.
Crudité.
Crudité, thank you.
Vegetable platter for the rest of us.
For the rest of us being overpriced, and they're making fun of him all over the place, and now he's saying he was tired, he needed a nap, and so it just, I mean, it's anyway. So they're probably going to lose in Pennsylvania. Oz just keeps fumbling the ball, and now. It looks like Barnes is doing really well in Wisconsin. Barnes again is the lieutenant governor in Wisconsin. He's won statewide race. He's a bona fide progressive. He's not a moderate who's won in this. This is a purple state, but as I said before, Ron Johnson made the mistake of thinking he's in Oklahoma or something. He took on the big lie, ran with it, and he's not. He's in a very purple state, and a state that takes Social Security and Medicare and all of that stuff very seriously. There's a lot of and it's it's a state with a labor Democratic tradition, even if it's socially conservative in a lot of ways. And he may have misplayed his hand here. And as we talked about, he's got this poll that we've got polls close in other states. It may be that the blue wall of the Rust Belt, the Democrats are building back. We can talk about some of the other states too, but the polls are even close in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And 538 is not reversing their analysis. They're still giving Herschel Walker the advantage in Georgia, even giving him more of a chance than the Republicans in Nevada, where I think they have a better chance than in Georgia, quite frankly. But pundits take a long time to change their opinions, but they're finally, as I predicted a few weeks ago, taking Barnes seriously as a candidate. We can talk about the House in a minute, but I'm thinking that the Democrats have more than a slight chance of winning, of holding on to the Senate. I think they have a good chance of expanding their seats. I don't know that they're going to lose any seats.
So it's been an interesting swing because before I was on leave, it was 60-40 favoring the Republicans on 538 and others, the odds of the Republicans taking the Senate. And then within a week, it was even. And then within another week, it's 60-40 the other way. Now you've reported today that it's 63 out of 100. So the tide has turned immensely in the last 3-4 weeks. And so it boils down to, I think, I'm seeing a lot of, there's really 6 or so, 7 states, but there are 4 states that are really the ones that they think are the where it's going to be decided. And you mentioned, Pennsylvania is one of them, and Georgia you mentioned, And those two candidates, those two Republican candidates, are anything we thought about as Sarah Palin. We could say Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker are orders of magnitude worse candidates for many, many reasons. They're just awful candidates, and they're candidates because Trump likes celebrities, and Trump's like, go with the name you know. And it's like, yeah, but Herschel Walker is functionally illiterate, unfortunately for him. I love him as a football player, always loved him, but as a senator, not so much. And Dr. Oz, celebrity personality who's just not fit for prime time.
And you have to combine the fact that those are bad candidates with the fact that the Democrats seem to have picked some very capable candidates.
Yeah. So that's two. That's two. Yeah. And there's two more states, Arizona and Nevada. And so Arizona to be determined, but a pretty awful candidate the Republicans have there, against a sitting senator who's done a pretty good job and is pretty popular. And Nevada, arguably Nevada might not work out for Democrats, but it could because of it very well could.
Laxalt being a very decent candidate, at least a good candidate against, I won't say she's a bad candidate, but maybe a lackluster one.
Yeah, so if those four go, well. that those four would end up it being 51-49. Democrats not just keep the 50-50, but they take the 51. And so they really need another one to make up for Manchin and Sinema. And so the question is possibly North Carolina, like you said, it's trending in direction that is interestingly somehow competitive. Wisconsin is trending in a direction that's competitive, and Ohio, J.D. Vance, another Trump candidate who not ready for prime time, but somehow ends up in the senatorial candidate seat. So the path is there for Democrats to. I mean, one of the things that my friends and family and colleagues we've talked about is, man, the Senate, that just looks so desperate. But in fact, it's not desperate anymore. I'll let you say anything else you want to say about that, of course. But when it comes to the House, I'm a little less confident.
We'll talk about the House in a minute. But for both the House and the Senate, I think we really need to take into account the potential for the Roe effect. Totally. You have the Trump effect and the other, but if you look at those special elections, the Republicans won those special elections, but they were closer than they should have been, I think, due to the Roe effect, as well as the Kansas vote. So, I think we're going to see that however you see the polls, you got to take into account that maybe you got to move it towards the Democrats a little bit, just like you had to take into account the Trump effect in both 16 and 20, because there are more, particularly younger women, but also younger voters registering that don't fit into the likely voter formulas.
Yep.
So why don't we move on to the House? Now the House, they've had, when we started, it was 13 out of 100 to the Democrats. I believe today it was like 22 or 23, still heavily favoring the Republicans, but there's definitely been movement in favor of the Democrats. A lot harder for the Democrats to win because everything is so skewed. Whereas the Senate's, you've got competitive races everywhere, very few competitive races. It's either or, black or white, kind of yin yang in there. Very few competitive races, and so it's hard to shift. And so if there's any type of thing, but the other thing I want to make note of is Biden. His popularity has shifted 3 points on average over the past week because finally things are getting done. So if the price of food does start to drop, and it may, we'll see, that's and things start to go well for him, and this Roe vote comes out. I'm not saying that they'll hold on to the House, but I don't say all hope is lost. But go ahead.
I'm with you. Yeah. So where we were, like I said, maybe 6 weeks ago or so, a very different place than we are now. In part, the trifecta, basically, the Roe decision and the evidence in Kansas that people who would normally be on the sideline, whether it's moderates or just not that active Democrats or not that willing to cross over Republicans, typically, all three of those things happened in Kansas. You saw Republicans cross over, you saw moderates come out, and you saw a higher turnout of Democrats supporting the basically trying to block a constitutional amendment that would allow the Republican-controlled state legislature to ban abortion. So there was a protection of a right. The people came out of the woodwork. I'd like to call that like a fifth dimensional intervention. It's not the normal. It's an anomaly. And then you factor in Biden. Biden really didn't have a whole lot of success to run on. But suddenly, like we talked about last week, there's this list of about 12 things that we kind of forget about, but not the least of which is transformational climate change package that will, also a transformation to a certain extent of the tax code. The minimum tax for corporations is actually a historic change that's underwhelmingly being talked about. There's a bunch of things in there, but then finally
taking out the guy in Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. Getting the leader of Al Qaeda and also Trump himself proving to be a little bit fallible. Like I said, there's a little bit of a tear in the fabric of his invulnerability cloak is somehow getting torn. So there's a lot of small things that lead us to believe that there's 90 days or 85 days or whatever it is might be enough time for some of these local races to encourage people. And not to filibuster here, and I apologize, but one last thing. I heard a commentator, Malcolm Nance, who's a former national security advisor to President Clinton. I heard him talking about, hey, look, with all this violence that keeps coming up. He was talking in July, so it was before the raid on Trump's house. But he wrote a book about it before the election where he said, Republicans are prone to violence in this climate based on being stoked, etc. The language encouraging violence. And he said, well, what do you do about it? And somebody asked him, what do we do about it? He said, vote. He said 60% of the people don't vote. And so that's the number one weapon that we have against actions of violence that are authoritarian or counter to democracy is vote. So that could happen. People could turn out.
There's also an article, I'm trying to remember what periodical it was in, but the 1934 elections were one of those exceptions to the midterms. The Democrats did really well after it, and partly because it was the New Deal, but also the Republicans had no program. They were just anti. And that was part of the problem. They don't have anything. I mean, they've had a health care plan that they've been promising for 12 years. Where is it, right? They were in power for 2 years. I mean, it's just and the Democrats are starting to push that in some of their campaigns. Where is their health care plan? I mean, Barnes is pushing that in Wisconsin. Where's your health care plan? It's just it's been 12 years. So it's so that I think they're taking some lessons from that, and not only did they not lose in 1934, but they made actually some solid gains, and that's how they were able to expand on the New Deal. I mean, that was historic. So, but again, we'll see. I mean, there's a lot to make up for, and there is the structural advantage that the Republicans have in a lot of those states. This is not 1934 in a lot of ways. So, it's just but and it's hard to register because polls really are even less accurate on a district by district basis. You need big areas of population to be able to get a good statistical sample. But and the generic poll, I don't even know why they bother with the generic Democrat versus Republican. I think those are totally meaningless. It's just done. But
I want to ask you, not to interrupt you, but just if you after you finish your thought, tell us a little bit about gerrymandering and kind of the impact that might have.
Well, the gerrymandering seems to have been a wash. As we discussed, and we had our special guest a few weeks ago when you were out, seems to have been a wash. Democrats actually were able to pick up gerrymandering in a few states. And in states where you had the independent commissions, Democrats just seemed to benefit, actually, like in California, for instance. But in Illinois, they were able to gerrymander and pick up states. But the Republicans had exhausted their gerrymandering, as I talked about earlier. They couldn't really pick up many more states. Florida, they picked up a few. That may actually get reversed unless, except for the Supreme Court. We just don't know. But, and they picked up one or two elsewhere. So there really isn't, they didn't pick up much. They got to pick up a couple because there was some movement from states, but then there was movement out of some red states too. I mean, Ohio lost one, and and the rest. And so it's hard to say who actually benefited, because there actually was also an increase in some competitive states, and it's going to depend on what happened in Nevada, because they created 3 competitive districts. In New Mexico, they created more competitive districts. The Democrats are rolling the dice here, so it's really going to be hard. We'll see what happens in New York, because New York, the Democrats tried to gerrymander, and the Democratic judges, Supreme Court judges, said, no, that's unfair. You can't do that. Democratic judges don't let Democrats do that. So, it just but there are a bunch of competitive districts there, so we won't know how it goes. But it's it's going to take massive voting. But the problem for the Republicans is there have been population shifts, and there are all the time. It's really hard for them to gerrymander in Georgia, for instance, because that Atlanta metropolitan area keeps expanding. More people move there, and they've got to make it at least roughly numerically equal. They can't, it's hard for them to contain, and that's just going to get harder and harder for them to gerrymander every time. And go ahead.
I was going to say, I think when you look at the average of swing during midterm elections over the last, I think it's like 10 cycles, it's in that 8 to 10% range. So typically presidents' parties are hit, it's somewhere close to 10%. And so I think that's why the odds are just so terribly stacked against Democrats this time around. But we might see that this is an anomaly year.
There is. I mean, 2002 was an anomaly year because of 9/11. Things happen that make things anomaly years, and we don't have to get into the discussion of the governors. But for a long time, it looked like it was going to be Republicans winning governors across the country. But that seems to have turned around for Democrats as well. It's just so I have a hard time believing that it's not going to have at least a little bit of an impact for the House and the Democrats. The problem is it's so razor thin that the Democrats only have to lose a few districts to lose the Congress. If it was like a 20-point difference, I would say that they had a good chance of holding it. But it's just with less than half a dozen, it just doesn't take much at all for them to do it. They really need to be able to make an argument that they can gain seats to do that, and it's going to be real hard. California, the Democrats will probably gain seats because of our voting. We've talked about the way we vote now. We're getting better turnouts.
Well, we'll see. We'll definitely see.
Okay, Dave, what have you got for predictions?
Well, this is an easy one. I think I threw it in there at the end of one of our segments. I'm not sure if it's going to make the cut or not, but we'll see how it goes. I think that Liz Cheney is posturing herself for a national presence, and I think Mike Pence is signaling that he is the man to beat for her lane, and I suspect that they're going to team up and that there's going to be a Pence-Cheney versus Trump-DeSantis competition.
That's a big one. Well, a few weeks ago when you were away, I made a prediction that Barnes, who was being ignored by the national media and the pundits, including 538, was going to be taken seriously within the few weeks as a contender. That has come true. One of my predictions actually came true. I'm now going to extend that same prediction to Tim Ryan. I believe that once polls start coming in from Ohio, Tim Ryan is going to be a serious contender. We'll be having this conversation about Tim Ryan in a few weeks. So wraps up this show. Anyways, I'll be back next week. I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of this stuff. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.